For the next talk, we are with Giulia GUADAGNOLI, and it's in English, of course, and about réglementation of platforms in European Union. Okay.
Does it work?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's in English. Sorry about that. I try to study French a lot, but apparently it's not working. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here today. This talk is going to be pretty policy-focused and less technical-focused, but I will try to give you an overview of what's happening in Brussels. I work in this think tank, Brussels-based think tank, that is called OpenForum Europe. And we work at the intersection of open technologies and digital policy, public policies in general, in the Brussels bubble. So I've been invited today to speak to you about, I would say, one of the major, if not the main, policy effort right now happening in Brussels, that is called the Digital Markets Act, or more simply DMA. And I will try to give you a very brief overview of this file, this dossier, and why I think it matters. But I will especially focus on a technical aspect that you probably already know about, that is interoperability, and how it finds its place in the file. I will try to give you a glimpse of all the different stakeholders that are at play right now, the different political actors, ranging from even smaller to bigger companies, together with the GAFAM, of course, so Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft, and even the civil society organizations, so the effort. And I will end up with giving you let's say, a description of the state of play right now of the negotiations in Brussels. So, as you might already know, probably, interoperability is one of the most basic principles on which the internet was built. It's a technical mechanism for computing systems to work together. Well-known examples of interoperability are like email, telephone calls, instant messaging. So you can send an email, a message, having a call with someone, regardless of your service providers or apps or devices that you're using. And the possibility for computing systems to work together, so the presence of interoperability, matters for market dynamics. That is why it's included. It's part of the Digital Markets Act. It matters for market dynamics because the lack of interoperability in any market, not only digital, think of the railways example, for instance. The lack of interoperability in the market, it strengthens the sort of concept, the winner takes all aspect, that reduces considerably competition, fair competition on a level playing field in the market. So either, in the case of the digital markets, either the users are pushed to use just one or just a few digital platforms. I will try not to make any names, but okay, let's say that users are pushed to use just one or a few digital platforms, or if they want still to use more than that, they need to go through cumbersome workarounds and use multiple applications that are incompatible with each other. So this clearly leads to a reduction in not only competition, but also ultimately consumer choice. And if you zoom out a bit and think of it applied to the digital markets in general, again, digital, it's a specific example, but in general on the markets, there are some companies in this case, when there's a lack of interoperability, there are some companies that are kept out of the market because they cannot compete on a level playing field with the gatekeepers, in this case, with the big tech, let's say, the dominant platforms, because of the so-called network effects. That is when a digital platform exploits the sheer size of their own user base in order to gain advantage over all the other players. So an example a bit closer to home for this audience is probably the case, think of the business model of open source companies. Without interoperability, where's the chance for an open source company to provide an alternative to the market if there's no interoperability? Because of course the big tech, the larger companies, will try to take advantage of the network effects. And ultimately the open source companies are kicked out of the market. They cannot even start. So when it comes to interoperability, there's a long story behind it. Probably some of you might know even better than me that decades ago there was there was a need for interoperability in markets like the browsers or document formats. And legal and regulatory pressures. Back then, some of you might remember the European Commission's case on browsers. But thanks to these legal and regulatory pressures, the current incumbent platforms could scale up back then and compete on a level playing field. That is why allowing for interoperability kicked off in the first place competition in those markets. And now that we are talking about digital markets, I'm referring to actually a larger scale of services on operating systems or online search engines, social networking, the so-called NICs, so the number independent interpersonal electronic communication services, and so on and so forth. And it's interesting from the Brussels perspective how interoperability, that is a very technical word, actually became sort of a buzzword in Brussels. And I'm talking not only about the European Parliament, but also the Council of the European Union that represents the member states. So there are, not only in Brussels, actually, even in the US, if some of you might have heard already talking about the Access Act, that is really similar to the Digital Markets Act, that they are trying, given the power that the big techs are currently gaining because of this exploitation of their own network effects. In the US and the EU, the policymakers started feeling like it was the right moment to take action. And I will leave aside the US because, of course, we are more focused on the European Union. So what is happening right now in the European Union? Back to December 2020, so last year, the European Commission adopted this package that is called Digital Services Act package. And it's a huge legislative proposal that actually includes two different files: the Digital Markets Act, DMA, and the Digital Services Act, the DSA. That are, I would say, the most relevant files right now discussed in Brussels. They have so many different effects and spillovers almost everywhere, and we will arrive there. I will talk to you about it. But just in brief, the DSA, that we are not going to focus on today, but the DSA aims to establish a powerful transparency and clear accountability framework for several online players. It focuses more on the liabilities for illegal content, for instance. For several online players, the scope of the DSA is huge. It entails intermediary service providers all the way down, including hosting services, online digital platforms, and the so-called VLOPs, that are the very large online platforms that are similar, let's say, to the big tech, so the GAFAM. Now, on the other hand, the DMA, that is the one that we focus on today, and I believe is even more relevant to really change the market dynamics. So it traces back to the core of the problem when it comes to competition in the European Union. The aim of the main goal of this file is to increase competition in the digital markets. And it lays out upfront rules for the so-called gatekeeping platforms. So from now on, rather than say big tech, I will say gatekeepers. Gatekeeping platforms that are identified by a series of quantitative and qualitative criteria, such as market capitalization, turnover, the monthly active users count, and the number of core platform services provided. So the list of the criteria to identify a gatekeeper is actually one of the main negotiation points right now in Brussels. Because the moment that you enlarge or narrow down the scope, you include either only US companies or even European Union companies. And that changes a lot politically, of course, from a member state's perspective, from an international trade perspective. Are we adopting a law that only targets specifically US companies? Is it even legal? That is the sort of questions that are going around Brussels and are determining actually the whole conversation. So anyway, such criteria, as I said, are very political, and they are currently being discussed in Brussels. And it feels like from the negotiations, how they are going right now, it will probably be adopted in a very narrowed sense, these criteria, and they will only target GAFAM. Maybe not even Amazon. We don't know. we will need to see, of course, at the end of this whole process. Now, what's the process? I won't make a lecture out of it. We are not at European law class, but just bear with me for the few seconds from now on. So we have, let's say, 3 different players here: the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council of the European Union. The European Commission kicks off the process of adopting a law. By adopting a legislative proposal, the European Commission thinks of it as a government and acts in the interest of the European Union. So the European Commission adopts the legislative proposal, and that's what happened in December 2020. After that, the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament take the lead. And the main characteristic of European law is that they both need to jointly agree on the text before adopting it. It's like in any, like for instance in Italy, I'm Italian. It's the same for us, for House of Representatives and the Senate. So in this case, think of the European Parliament as the House of Representatives that acts in the interest of the European citizens. It's elected by the European citizens. Think of the Council as a Senate that acts in the interest of the member states. These two need to jointly agree with the help of the European Commission, that it's always there during the negotiations anyway. Right now, as I said, the legislative proposal has been adopted, so Parliament and Council are discussing. And apparently they really want to speed up the process. That may be adopted early next year, we will see. But we are talking about 2 very complicated files, so probably the negotiations will be longer than expected. Now, when it comes to all the others that are surrounding the Brussels bubble, so let's say civil society organizations, when it comes to lobbying, in the case of the DMA and the DSA, it's interesting to notice that there's a huge imbalance in resources allocated to lobbying efforts from the civil society organizations that are addressing the DSA mostly, rather than the DMA, because the scope of the DSA is broader. And it talks about liabilities for the online platforms, whatever they are. So it's actually, it matters in terms of fundamental rights, so that's why the civil society is focusing there. But all this imbalance of resources allocated for time and resources constraints by the civil society organizations to the DSA is leaving an open window for the gatekeepers to assign resources in lobbying to the DMA. The ratio, it's of course just, it's not precise, but for any meeting that the civil society organizations have on the DMA, GAFAM have 20, 30 meetings already. This is sort of the imbalance of resources that we're talking about. Now, at the moment, as I said, the negotiations will probably last for a while, and one of the reasons why it's such a controversial new policy, the DMA, is for interoperability. Interoperability, that interestingly enough, actually, it's a subparagraph of a subparagraph of an article. That is Article 6.1f, and it lays out the interoperability provision. And it's one of the most debated parts. It's literally 10 words, if you want to know. That's how geek I am about this article. It's 10 words, and it's making a fuss in Brussels, just that article, that subparagraph. And specifically said, without reciting it, but specifically said that the gatekeepers, in this case the big tech, as the negotiations go, they shall provide their own services, ancillary services, and I will tell you what they are, interoperable with business users and providers of ancillary services. Now, in the DMA, there's a distinction between core platform services and ancillary services. The core platform services are almost all of them. So we are talking about online intermediation services, marketplaces, for instance, online search engines, or cloud services, advertising services, video sharing platform services, social networking, NICs, number-independent interpersonal electronic communication services, and maybe, operating systems, so almost all of them. Ancillary services are identification or payment services, or all the technical services that help delivering identification or payment services. So it's a very small scope if you understand right now for the article, we are talking about interoperability only there. That is why civil society organizations and quite a few open source companies right now are trying to actively engage finally with the DMA to extend the interoperability provision to all core platform services, or at least to social networking, so the SNs, or the NICs, and the NICs for the civil society, because it matters in terms of privacy concerns, let's say, for the end users. So the classic example, WhatsApp and Signal, making them interoperable. That's what civil society is trying to do. And the main argument at the basis of both civil society organizations and the open source companies, I would say open source because it's mostly open source what they are doing right now, engaging with the file to extend the interoperability provision, is a matter of competition, innovation, consumer choice, and digital sovereignty. So when it comes to competition, we already sort of touched base on it, but just again, specifically on the DMA. Interoperability, they say, these advocates, they say that extending interoperability provision to core platform services is a key factor to allow to enable fair competition, which in turn would restore the current unbalanced relationship between the small players, digital players, and GAFAM. Let's say, the gatekeepers, whoever they will be at the end of this process. And they note how right now digital markets where incumbent companies, so the gatekeepers, use the user base as a way to kick out companies from the markets are clearly not contestable, are clearly not allowing for fair competition. In these, gatekeepers build these closed ecosystems that a lot of people are addressing with walled gardens in order to kick out competition. And they are trying to build these closed ecosystems, the advocates say, through these walled gardens, through the lack of interoperability, because that's how you kick out players from the market. And this is why these advocates want to extend to make it as interoperable as possible, the markets, because in that case, let's think of, again, open source companies, but it could be actually every digital player that wants to compete on a level playing field. They could actually provide their own innovative products with if there was interoperability with the existing user base of the gatekeepers. So in the case, again, WhatsApp and Signal users, so Signal company, could actually provide their own services related to the WhatsApp users. And again, this leads me actually to the second point on consumer choice. Civil society organizations are really pushing for interoperability on social media and NICs because of, let's think about the consumer-facing digital platforms, so again, social media. If the consumers are allowed to be interoperable with each other, so to communicate across silos, in that case, the end users, mostly citizens, mostly people like us, they wouldn't need to sign up and create an account on a platform that they would otherwise dislike, but they have to, just because of the large user base that platform provides. In that case, if there was interoperability, there would be consumer choice in the sense that these users could actually sign up and create account on platforms that match their actual preferences in terms of, I don't know, user interface innovation or content moderation rules or privacy protection policy inside of that company. Again, a third point by these such advocates is innovation. There are a lot of discussions around it because especially GAFAM sustain that interoperability hinders innovation, actually. It's an obstacle to innovation. And these other stakeholders are trying to say that this is not the case because actually interoperability, by enabling new entrants in the market, it stimulates innovation because, of course, being competition, you need to provide the users with better and more innovative products. And, of course, when there's interoperability, you base interoperability on specific standards or you need a basic set of functionalities. But that, in the words of these advocates, that doesn't prevent any company, regardless of the size, to build innovative products on top of these functionalities. That's why there's no such thing as an obstacle for innovation. And finally, the ultimate argument is digital sovereignty. So if we want to abstract a bit and to zoom out and look at the European Union as a whole, away from market dynamics, we can say that the ultimate argument made is that such extension to core platform services would actually result in more efficiency for the public administrations. If we want to think about public administrations as end users, now for a second, we would say, yeah, more efficiency, because it would provide them, being end users, with real choice across a different set of alternatives, you know, not only the big platforms. And in that case, they could choose the alternative that better fits with their own needs and the needs of their citizens. These would stem from a greater flexibility and lower costs that are actually defined as reducing costs, switching costs, and anti-competitive barriers for that are created by the so-called vendor lock-in phenomenon to a specific service providers. This would result in increased Europe's digital sovereignty by allowing new markets in the entrance, maybe from new entrants in the market from Europe, maybe, and one could argue open source alternatives that would reduce the vendor lock-in phenomenon, as well as provide the public administrations with better value for money, with a good value for money. Now, the state of play, what's happening, what happened at the beginning. This is going to be an oversimplification of the process that was highly political and a lot of stakeholders engaged back then. But at the beginning of the process, just to give you an overview, in the European Parliament, especially in the main committee that is called IMCO, is the committee responsible for the file, as well as all the other committees that are committee for opinion interested in the file, there was some sort of polarization when it came to interoperability. We could say that the center-left and the Greens were in favor of interoperability, of an extension of interoperability, and to the point that they made interoperability one of the main points in their own messages as a political group. Interoperability was really like the buzzword for them, everywhere. The center-right, on the other hand, represented by the liberals and the Christian Democrats, showed some skepticism around interoperability. Interoperability extended, non-interoperability per se. Nobody tried to narrow it down, the scope of the article. Everybody agreed from the start on ancillary services. The problem was the core platform services. Now, there was a change after all the negotiations in the European Parliament at some point, and the European Parliament seems, right now, it will need to vote mid-December, but it seems to be drifting towards an extension of interoperability on social media and NICs. On the other hand, the Council has been pretty silent on it. It didn't really show any really particular focus on all the obligations, not only interoperability. But there's a reason why it's not really surprising. As I told you already, the Council represents the member states. And the member states don't really care, didn't really show an interest in specific obligations. They, being member states and governments, they of course care about everything that can shake the international relations sphere. And in the case of the DMA, there are two things that can shake it. The scope. Who are we addressing here? Are we talking about US-only based companies? That can have effects on international trade. With the US right now, after Trump, the situation is pretty tense between the two. And second, and the end, yes, it's the enforcement part. So who's going to implement the DMA? The Commission only or the national authorities? So let's determine the role and the power of the national authorities. We will see what will happen. The Council and the European Parliament would probably come to an end next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giulia. Thank you. So very exciting and a lot of teasings. But what will happen? Okay, is there any question? No? Yes? Maybe.
Thank you for the presentation. Is there a way for us, as a simple citizen, to do some kind of pushing to lobbies or whatever? Is there a way to sign online something, or do I write to my deputy, or what can I do?
Thank you for this question. It's actually interesting. It's interesting to notice that someone, as a citizen, can be interested in the topic. Look, in Brussels, citizens can actually do something at the very beginning of the process. Because, as I said, so the European Commission adopts the legislative proposal. But before adopting it, it opens a public consultation where everyone can submit, not only companies, not only civil society, whoever, also citizens can submit their own, in the public consultation, their own feedback on the impact assessment that is like the overview of the file before it can be adopted. And for the digital, this is a fun fact for me, again, a geek of policy, there were 2,888 feedback submitted to the Digital Services Act. That was the beginning of the process before the DMA was even started. And this is a huge number that actually highlights a great interest on people. Like I skimmed through all of those feedback one day, and there were a lot of citizens. Right now, it's a bit trickier because we are at a stage where only policy players, I would say, can actually do something. So the civil society organizations are really putting a lot of, to the top of their own possibilities, of course. They're putting a lot of effort in it. The companies, so maybe what the companies can do is different, but as a citizen per se, not really, no. It's at the very beginning of a stage. Maybe you might be interested as a citizen on the Data Act, but even, for instance, the public consultation on the Data Act that is going to address the cloud services on B2B, B2G issues, it already closed the public consultation. It's just, you need to, when it comes to Brussels, you need to be always updated because there's a public consultation, you have 1 month and you need to submit it as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you. Another question? Yeah.
Thank you for your brilliant presentation for a very complex subject. I'm not sure to have understood all, but anyway, I try to ask my question in English. So after what you said, can we, being pessimistic or optimistic for the future, and this kind of process, DMA or DSA, can change the rules in terms about, for instance, operating system and document format to change the standard for European?
Thank you for the question. It's a very complicated question, actually. First of all, optimistic, pessimistic, depending on when you stand. I don't know if you like Google or you like civil society. It really depends. But since we are at an open source, I can assume where you stand. So in that case, I can tell you the policymakers are trying to keep the two files, DSA, DMA, aligned, in the sense that they want one to complement the other, which is extremely hard from a political perspective because there are different political groups. They are trying to make compromises here and there. The problem for which many, I'm only an observer here, I'm not saying any opinion, I'm not talking for my organization. So many are pessimistic in the sense that the policymakers, given what's happening right now in the international relations world, so this has geopolitical implications, the DMA especially. Given the current geopolitics, the member states want to adopt the file, the DMA, if it's kept aligned with the DSA, both of them. They want to adopt them as soon as possible. Adopting such a complex file, such two complicated files, in 6 months is almost impossible. And if you do it wrong. you do it in a way that you make so many compromises that at the end of the day, the text is, I mean, I don't want to say that it will look like a joke, right? But something will definitely change, but all of the obligations listed will just capture a glimpse, just a minimum part, a very small part of the real problem. A lot of, especially the center left and the Greens, they are trying to, extend, to regulate as much as possible, because they all agree on the fact that we waited 20 years for these two files, because these two files aim to update the e-commerce directive in the 2000s. So we waited 20 years. Are we going to wait 20 other years? In markets that are evolving so fast, because the digital markets are not like railways, that you can wait for a while. Digital markets, every 5 years, maybe the situation has changed. So pessimistic, probably. If they actually care, especially the member states, for political reasons, international political reasons, they care about speeding up the process, then the process will really make, I don't know, here and there we will try to make some obligations, but they're not going to really say anything. And it's a pity, because this is a chance for the European Union to really gain digital sovereignty, according to these people, again. So yeah, and the second question that you asked me on document formats. So right now, the current list of core platform services, again, even that one is negotiated, but for the better. So they actually want to add stuff to that. There is browsers. They want to include web browsers and voice assistants. France wants to. So we will see what's going to happen. But the current list that is object of negotiation includes already, you mentioned operating systems. It's part of the list. And document formats. What are document formats? It's about content sharing, if you want, right? Like, it's the same supply chain. You just, when you talk about NICs, for instance, I actually had a nice conversation about it today. When you talk about the NICs, you don't only talk about the SMS at the end. You don't talk about the final WhatsApp. You talk about the whole supply chain. So if they manage to extend interoperability to the NICs, then document formats needs to be part of it. Because I'm gonna attach it to I'm gonna send a PDF, whatever, ODT or a docx file to you on WhatsApp. So it needs to be part of it, yes. It already is. And it's a fight ongoing.
I was thinking about this.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you very much, Giulia. Thank you for you too.